Hello, I'm delighted to have Dr. Tricia Bacon on this week's episode of Conflict and Terrorism Studies with Wisdom. She recently published a paper titled De-Talibanization and the Onset of Insurgency in Afghanistan in the Journal of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. Actually, she co-authored it with Daniel Byman. Hello, Tricia. It's a great opportunity to talk to you about your paper today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We'll go straight to the first question. Uh, our viewers and listeners would like to know about the background of this paper, the context of what motivated you to write this paper. Is it a puzzle, a debate? What is it that drove you to do this research?
I think what motivated this was the finalization, or at least at the time, the finalization of the US Taliban negotiated deal last year. The striking a deal with the Taliban, especially how strong the Taliban is at this phase, caused Dan and I to look back and remember that there was a several-year period after the US invasion and overthrow of the Taliban in December 2001, where the group was weak and there was really no organized insurgency in Afghanistan. And it's easy to forget that now, given the number of years we've been at war in Afghanistan, and ask a very basic question, which was, why did the insurgency in Afghanistan begin? What were the factors that contributed to initiating the insurgency after several years of fairly disorganized low-level violence? So as we reach possibly a negotiated settlement and an end to the war, we wanted to look back at the beginning of the war and see what were the causes of the insurgency.
Great. So, given this background, what's your core argument in the paper?
So it seems at first, when you think about it, that this might be a topic that got a lot of attention and there has been a number of works published on, but actually there's fewer articles published on this than one might think. There had been a really good article by Seth Jones shortly after the insurgency began in 2005, in which he argued that it was the Taliban's ideology and it was a lack of governance that was behind the insurgency. And there was sort of a policy consensus in the United States that part of the reason for the insurgency in Afghanistan was that the US diverted its attention to Iraq and invaded Iraq in 2003. And so when Dan and I started this, we wanted to see in either case, our argument was that these were factors, but they weren't sufficient on their own. The Taliban's ideology hadn't really changed. And so why were there several years of a lack of violence given the ideology? And Afghanistan had experienced a lack of governance for decades. And so why would that have been enough in 2005? And as well, we saw that the US was not prepared to invest in Afghanistan before it went into Iraq under the Bush administration. So we saw those arguments as important, but not enough to fully understand. And Dan in particular had done a lot of work on Iraq. And so we know that de-Talibanization, de-Ba'athification in Iraq was a huge part of precipitating the insurgency there. So we wanted to look more closely at Afghanistan to try to understand what decisions may have contributed. And what we argue is that there was, before de-Ba'athification, there was essentially an informal de-Talibanization policy in Afghanistan. We didn't declare it as such the way that we did in Iraq, but there was a comparable policy that existed in Afghanistan, and that it had a number of unanticipated and negative repercussions that contributed to the insurgency, along with some of the other factors that people had identified before. So the main argument is that this uncompromising approach to the Taliban, this de-Talibanization policy, had three major impacts that together really explain the timing and the onset of the insurgency in Afghanistan.
Great. So what was the empirical approach? How did you test this argument?
One of the things that we were doing with this article was arguing that this wasn't the result of some new revelations or declassified material or anything like that. More that there were a number of arguments that people had made sort of separately on the different factors under de-Talibanization. And what we wanted to do was show that the existing evidence that people had pointed to. The existing data, the existing analysis, actually, when you brought it together, came under this rubric of de-Talibanization. So it wasn't, while I did do field research in Afghanistan, this wasn't sort of us arguing that we were breaking new ground and discovering new information, rather that we wanted to take the information that existed and shed a new light on it. So we drew heavily from journalistic accounts, analytic accounts in Afghanistan, and policy discussions, revelations about policy discussion, and recast them as understanding them as part of this de-Talibanization policy. That the decisions, for example, in Bonn in 2001 to exclude the Taliban, that's been noted by a number of important policymakers and scholars as the original sin of the conflict, that excluding the Taliban from the Bonn conference and thus the future government of Afghanistan was a strategic mistake. Our argument is, yes, that was a strategic mistake, but it was actually reflective of this de-Talibanization policy, and it was one of the impacts that we had as a result of that policy. So in a way, it's a retelling of some of the factors that people were aware of, but putting this new framework to understand why the US undertook those policies.
Okay, beautiful. Can you briefly discuss this framework clearly again so that we understand what the framework you applied or introduced is like? Then you maybe with that you expand on your primary findings,
Yes.
and maybe some of the findings you did, some of your findings you didn't anticipate that
Yes. Yes, exactly. So our framework is that this de-Talibanization policy was set very early. It was set in December 2001, and that was when we saw some of the Taliban leaders try to surrender. They knew they had been defeated, and they tried to surrender. And the Afghan government, or the nascent Afghan government, was open to this, but the US was not. And the US never really revisited that policy until the insurgency was fully underway. And this uncompromising view that the Taliban had to be purged resulted in three effects that were unanticipated. The first was the underrepresentation of Pashtuns in the new Afghan government, including at the Bonn conference that I mentioned in December 2001. But overall, it resulted in a government that was largely dominated by ethnic minorities and underrepresented Pashtuns in terms of their historic role in governing, as well as their numeric size in the population. And then that created some grievances amongst the Pashtun population. The second was that it led the United States to empower certain strongmen, warlords, who were willing to target the Taliban. And because the Taliban we weren't going to allow them to surrender, the US wasn't going to allow them to surrender, the idea was they had to be targeted, and they had to be targeted actively. So the US made arrangements with these local strongmen who were willing to hunt down the Taliban. And in so doing, in pursuing the counterterrorism mission, they were also predatory actors in terms of how they treated the population. They used the United States to advance their own agendas, their own tribal, ethnic, local grievances, rivalries, and competitions, as well as create an environment where the Taliban basically had no choice whether to live in Afghanistan. So they either had to flee or fight. They couldn't stay. And so that rather than a lack of governance, it was the empowering of these strongmen, which resulted in predatory governance, because a number of them went into the government. So we had this combination of ethnic grievances and then strongmen who were empowered, who were preying on the population while helping the United States to hunt the Taliban. And then the third effect was, because of this environment, the Taliban fled to Pakistan. And Pakistan was the one country who was most dissatisfied with losing the Taliban, with the composition of the new Afghan government. And so the de-Talibanization policy essentially pushed the Taliban to the country who was most willing to help the Taliban rebuild. And it also created a tension for the United States because the Pakistanis were willing to help on Al-Qaeda. And so we focused on what they were willing to do with Al-Qaeda, and we did not push them on their willingness to provide haven for the Taliban. And so essentially these three parts of the equation, the Pashtun disenfranchisement, the strongmen being empowered, and the Pakistanis being dissatisfied with the new order and not facing US pressure for helping the Taliban. Those three factors gradually coalesced into an insurgency in 2005 by allowing the Taliban to reorganize and then exploit grievances that were growing amongst the population because of the predatory strongmen and the exclusion from the political process. So essentially, this one policy decision had these three effects that then worked together to cause the insurgency to start. And once it started, other factors came into play in its perpetuation. We were really just looking at that point of the onset of the insurgency.
Great. Thank you very much for that clear explanation. So, what do you think are the implications of these findings to the larger literature on insurgency or setting, especially when we find that a lot of literature a lot of scholars tend to focus on ideology, focus on the grievance approach, and from what you've found now, it's like the insurgency onsets are explained out of context. So how does your paper and your framework fit into the existing literature?
I think in some respects, we argue that the case in Afghanistan was unique, and we don't want to claim that it is a representative case of a lot of different insurgencies or a lot of different conflicts. There was a unique environment after 9/11 in terms of how the US was thinking about the threat and the counterterrorism overdrive of the post 9/11 period. Having said that, we do see that there is a lesson there, which is that military defeat, which is what we accomplished in 2001 against the Taliban, is not necessarily the period at which we should declare victory and assume that we don't have to deal with the vanquished organization at that point. In fact, that may be the point to try to integrate the organization, or at least some of the more pragmatic or reconcilable elements of a group, into the political system, rather than create a situation where there's a military defeat and no avenues to return to society or return to government. What we're arguing is that military victory is not going to be enough in some of these cases. And of course it wasn't in the Taliban case, that we have to follow it up with political victories. And we weren't able to do that in Afghanistan. The corruption and the predation of the government, as well as the inability for the Taliban to return it in any way, shape, or form into the new system, created a perfect storm. And so it creates a sort of a cautionary tale that while it's tempting after a military victory to say that you don't have to deal with an actor that you find abhorrent because of their ideology or their past, that may be the moment to consider coming to some kind of arrangement where they're weakened and they may be willing to compromise, and you can head off any future resurgence or future comeback from the organization, or at least minimize its scope by making arrangements then, which of course, in the case of Afghanistan, we have hindsight, which is 2020, but we are dealing now with a Taliban that is far more powerful, far more effective, and can demand quite a bit larger share of power than they would have been able to had there been some effort to reintegrate and reconcile and deal with them in the period from 2001 to 2005.
Thank you very much. So, what are the limitations? Yeah, definitely, we always have limitations in doing research, but are there any specific limitations that maybe researchers who would want to, or would be researchers who would want to research about the onset of insurgency in the Taliban insurgency? Are there any limitations you think they should be wary of, and how did you try to overcome some of these limitations? Would you advise also new researchers on how you think some of these could be avoided?
Yeah, in a way, this is a tricky topic, in part because we are dealing with a period of hindsight. And especially when you interview anyone who's associated with the insurgency, if you ask them why they began the insurgency, you get very ideological boilerplate answers about how they had to resist the external invasion and that they were bound to do so, even though they didn't do so for several years after. So it's hard to get candid answers from insurgents on questions like that. So that ended up being not as fruitful a line to really understand the calculus. It was more going back and looking at some of the policy deliberations and looking at the conditions at the time and really good works done by people at the time. So I think there is some limitations in our ability to get insurgents to sort of admit some of the things from the past, especially now. So that was certainly one of the limitations we faced in looking at this. I think another limitation that we faced was there was a very politically difficult environment in the United States at the time. It is a bit easier to say in hindsight that we should have compromised with the Taliban in some way when they were defeated, when the domestic political considerations were very, very strong for retribution and retaliation and the reaction to 9/11. And again, this is something that in hindsight, we can more easily make recommendations about, but one can lose sight of the environment at the time and how intense the environment was at the time. And I think that's another cautionary point for researchers is we get distance from an event and we can analyze it more objectively and we can see the problems, but we do have to keep in mind the atmospherics at the time. And I don't think that while 9/11 was, of course, a seminal event, I don't think that caution is unique to the situation in Afghanistan. So those were two of the factors that we grappled with in particular. And we do try to acknowledge that we are dealing with hindsight and being able to look back at events and say, knowing what we know now, this would have been a better way to do it. And I think our hope is that there is lessons for other conflicts, even though we do think there are some things that were unique about Afghanistan, but we want to point out that military victory is not the end for some of these conflicts, that we have seen groups resurge after military defeat because there has not been a political defeat of them as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you quickly maybe talk about if you have any research, current research that is developing on these findings, and if you were to advise other researchers, what opportunities do they have, or what areas do you think the opportunity is ripe for them to research?
Yeah, absolutely. I am working on another project that looks at the role of foreign fighters in the insurgency in Afghanistan over time. Looking at from the point of the Taliban military defeat in December 2001 till now, what influence did foreign fighters have on the insurgency within Afghanistan? And were there periods where they had higher levels of influence? And if so, what enabled that? And did they have periods where they basically had little influence, and what was hindering their influence? So really trying to look at foreign fighter influence over time. So that's one of my current projects that's related to this. But in terms of this project, I think that the Taliban US deal has opened up a whole host of questions on negotiations. When to negotiate, how to negotiate, what can be gained from negotiations, what is lost by negotiations within jihadist groups, which was once unthinkable. Jihadist groups were treated as sort of a separate entity that the normal rules of conflict resolution didn't apply to. And the US dealing directly with the Taliban the way that it did and coming to a deal, although as we're speaking, that deal is somewhat in question, it has raised a whole host of questions about the role of negotiations in conflict resolution, when to, and as I say, when to undertake them, how to undertake them. So I think there's some very policy relevant questions for researchers out there looking at different conflicts about the prospects for fruitful engagement or negotiations with some of these organizations, or in other cases, why that's not a viable option.
Thank you very much. I hope when you're done with your new research, we'll have opportunity to talk about it. I want to
Yeah,
thank you for
absolutely.
joining us on this episode. It has been an interesting one. Uh, for viewers and listeners out there, thank you for joining us for this episode. Please remember to rate us and send us your comments through your app. Also, subscribe and follow us so that you can receive our weekly program straight on your device. You should also reach out to us if you would like to discuss your recent publication on conflict and terrorism on this program. My name is Wisdom Yekepolo. Join me next week. Bye for now.